Well, good morning, and thank you very much indeed for this invitation. It's always fabulous to be here at Knowsley. I'm going to speak about why the British lost the American Revolutionary War. It's based on a book I did a while ago, and I thought it would be amusing to start by showing the different covers for the book in Britain and in America, because they're actually different. Even the subtitles are different in ways that I found very amusing, especially today on the 4th of July, as Americans celebrate their independence. So what you're looking at the moment is the cover of the American edition by Yale University Press. The painting is a wonderful painting that's in the City Museum in London, Guildhall Museum, and it's by John Singleton Copley, who's an American artist, and it's not actually a painting of the war in America, it's a painting from Gibraltar in the same period, where the British Army withstood the longest siege in their history by the French and Spanish. And it's a much bigger picture, as you'll see. If you actually visit the Guildhall, you find that it's almost like a fresco. It's almost life-size. And it's called The Men Who Lost America, but the subtitle is British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire. They also use my middle name, Jackson. That was partly out of humor because there's a somewhat notorious American president, Andrew Jackson. So this is the British cover. The first cover, by just focusing on the two leaders, essentially captures the idea of leadership. And a lot of people looked at the picture and said, oh yes, it looks as though the leader's giving commands and his deputy is saying, what the hell are you thinking about? Which captures, I suppose, part of the caricature against which I wrote this book. But in the British version, you see we've got a much wider angle, and the British look like a victorious rugby scrum. In fact, the British publisher complained to me that books about failure don't sell. And I said, I can hardly change the conclusion or the events. But they did their best. The last section of this book is called Victory, for reasons that will become comprehensible, not least when Andrew Lambert speaks as well. But you'll notice the subtitle is different. Instead of British leadership, it's British command. And instead of the fate of the empire, it's the preservation of the empire. And they do not use my middle name. They said it sounded too American, and which is fair enough because I'm not. They just used my first surname. It's much more common, incidentally, to use middle names in the United States. Now, this was a war seemingly that Britain should have won. It seems like a David and Goliath type contest, and the British ought to have prevailed as a much larger and more professional military power. And the purpose of this book was to explain why they didn't. And the popular answer to that question has often been because the British were led by essentially buffoons. You see this most in movies and popular history, and they are the best guide to how the public perceive events. The academics tend to be less crude, but as we'll see, this also flows into the academic literature. So I'm going to show you a brief clip, I hope it'll work, from the film of Mel Gibson called The Patriot, in which he's depicting Lord Cornwallis in South Carolina And you'll see it's in a magnificent country home. It could easily be somewhere in England, more concerned about his uniform than about supplies from Britain. And he's speaking to one of the most feared British officers at the time, Bannister Tarleton, who's not identified as such in the movie, but it's clearly modelled on that. That is a genre you'll see in a lot of the movies about the American Revolution. Al Pacino also did a film, Revolution, in which the British leadership was similarly portrayed. And you get it in popular history writing as well. One of the most popular historians of the 1970s in the United States was Barbara Tuchman. And she did a book about war called The March of Folly. And the main theme of this book was that the stupidity of leaders throughout history. And it was really written against the Vietnam War in America. But a third of the book is devoted to British leadership during the American Revolution, in which basically she has a series of caricatures of all the commanders. And it even seeps into serious scholarly history. You get words like hidebound to describe the British commanders. So my book really looks at the leaders of the British side, both political and military. It by no means attempts to absolve them of every decision. Certainly, with hindsight, some of the decisions could have been better, but it shows them to be people of real substance. A lot of them were the best and the brightest at the time, and highly experienced. And you saw the portrayal of Cornwallis. Well, this was someone who certainly didn't sit around in country houses in America. This was the man at Rams's Mill in North Carolina, burnt his entire supplies, much of his rum and food, and essentially lived off the land and slept out in the open with his soldiers, and who'd been a soldier since the age of 14. Now, these were people as serious about their military careers as their modern-day counterparts. And a lot of people saw an analogy with a book that was written about the Vietnam War called The Best and the Brightest, which similarly shows, and I hadn't read it when I published this book, but it similarly shows that far from being buffoons, the people who ran the Vietnam War, while making a terrible error and increasingly lying to the American public, nevertheless represented one of the most distinguished war cabinets in American history. Well, the 11 people, of course, include George III, the king at the time, who I thought would possibly be the least interesting, who's certainly the figure who for a long while was most subject to caricature, although there have been two good biographies, one of which is by Jeremy, which I think was the best that had been written. The other, more recently, by Andrew Roberts. Jeremy's is shorter, and I think captures many of the same ideas, but they have sought to some extent to rehabilitate George III. George III was the one who, in the Declaration of Independence, is essentially held responsible for the entire revolution and American crisis, something Jefferson would have known not to have been the case. Much of what he's accused of, such as the slave trade, was by no means of his creation. What was interesting to me about George III is actually he played very little role in the policies that led to the American Revolution. These were the policies of his prime minister. And like today, policies are enacted in name of the king, but it's the politicians who are largely responsible, although the king could play a much larger role in this period. George III did not. He even tempered some of the more extreme policies that were proposed towards America. But he did become very actively involved after the Boston Tea Party. In fact, he became quite obsessed. This is a portrait by the American artist Benjamin West in the middle of the war. And George III, essentially after the Boston Tea Party and the destruction of British tea in Boston Harbor in 1774, he became convinced that only military means could solve this political issue, and that it was essential for Britain to win the Revolutionary War. In fact, he articulated Britain's motives better really than any of his cabinet members, because he said, if we lose America, we'll cease to be a great power in Europe. So he saw it as all important. And what was so interesting is he became almost his own prime minister at the height of this war. He becomes the driving force. He gives the cabinet pep talks to rally them, to keep them at the helm. And when he hears news of Yorktown and Cornwallis's defeat, his attitude is that Britain can still go on, that we must continue. We can't afford to lose this war. So he does become the main warmonger, and it could be argued that the war lasted longer because of him. His prime minister wanted to resign, and ministers who wanted to come into office were interested in a negotiated peace. Lord North was the prime minister at the time. He is known to this day as the worst prime minister in British history. I think it was last quoted at David Cameron, but it's frequently been quoted in Parliament to accuse who's ever in the office of being the worst prime minister since Lord North. It's a terribly unfair description. Lord North was a brilliantly successful politician, but what is even more impressive is he held essentially the modern equivalents of Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was running the financial side of the country while also maintaining this coalition, having followed 7 governments in a decade. He was the first prime minister for a while to actually create a successful ministry, and what is very striking, to continue to be a war leader for so long. Most prime ministers fell during wartime, even the great Walpole, and he was a great survivor. He would typically give 3-hour speeches in the House of Commons and wait to be one of the last speakers. He spoke with no notes. Jeremy quoted Edward Gibbon earlier. Gibbon was a member of Parliament, the author of Decline and Fall, was a member of Parliament at the same time. He said, "This was my education as a historian. The speeches I was hearing were brilliant." And indeed, this is one of the great periods of parliamentary debate, with some of the most brilliant opposition speakers at any time. I thought about this a lot during the Iraq War, that the quality of the speeches against the war were far surpassed anything we heard in Britain and America then, or more recently during Afghanistan. You had the likes of Charles James Fox, Edmund Burke, and William Pitt, the older and the younger. As Burke said of William Pitt, the younger, he wasn't just a chip off the old block, he was the old block. I mean, all brilliant speakers, and yet Lord North often won against them. He could also give his speech as Chancellor without notes, citing all the figures for the economy. And this was so impressive that people would come and sit in the galleries just to observe it, because it was such an incredible exercise. And the fact is, he kept the British budget afloat. Part of the reason for taxing America had been the concern of the huge British debt, which at times accounted for 30 to even almost half of the taxes, annual taxes each year, just paying for the interest on the debt. He kept it afloat. Remember, France did not stay afloat after the American Revolution. It was an achievement. At the beginning of the war, the command of the military was by two brothers. Sir William Howe, who commanded the army, and also his brother Richard, and who commanded the navy. This, of course, sounds like real nepotism, but William Howe insisted that if he was to command the army, his brother would have to be put in charge of the navy. That was very smart, because the army and navy were increasingly doing these combined amphibious operations. And in order to get really good coordination, having your brother and working together really made for a much more effective system. As it happened, the naval brother, who the government was not initially going to appoint, was, if anything, even more successful in his later career. Sir William Howe was not just some good old boy who was put in charge. He was not like old Fuss and Feathers, who was put in charge of the Union Army at the beginning of the Civil War, simply because he was the oldest and most senior commander. On the contrary, the British skipped 106 more senior generals. He'd only just risen to a junior rank among the generals in order to appoint him. And the reason they appointed him is he had had experience in America. And he understood what the British called Indian warfare, this more unconventional type of battle that the British knew they were going to face. As for his brother became a great naval hero later on. And we'll see in several cases, as with Cornwallis, that a few of these people were young enough to have subsequent successful careers. And his brother's a good example of how your situation can affect your success. And that context is all important. Sociologists like to speak of people being set up to fail. They just aren't given the resources, the right amenities in order to succeed. And he did very well in America, but he would later go on to fight the glorious 1st of June, as it was known, in the French Revolutionary Wars, and to be a hero to the point that his face would be on pub signs and there would be mugs and ceramics made commemorating him. John Burgoyne, who's associated with this house, because after his great defeat in America at Saratoga, he came to live here. John Burgoyne was not a senior commander. He never commanded the British Army in America. He was a junior commander. And one of the ironies of the war is that the two great defeats, Saratoga and Yorktown were under the command of more junior generals. Sir William Howe was never defeated in battle and always won the battles with Washington. That was some of the largest of the war. Burgoyne is probably one of the easiest to caricature, and he's certainly, and we're going to be hearing about him in a lot more detail later, he's certainly the general who most interests the Americans based on the number of biographies written. And there's only really been two serious biographies of Cornwallis. Sir Henry Clinton, who I'll mention in a moment, only one biography. So people are interested in Burgoyne, a very theatrical figure who in many ways sets himself up for failure. But it's important to remember that Burgoyne's performance up until the American Revolution had been outstanding. He was regarded as one of the rising talents in the British Army. This painting was done at the end of the 7 Years' War to commemorate a great victory in which he'd commanded in Portugal against the Spanish. And he also took really quite a cerebral interest in the military. So he did a survey at the end of the 7 Years' War and went round Europe looking at all the different militaries and looking at their strengths and weaknesses. And he makes very interesting points when he reported this all back to Pitt. He said, you can't really just transplant all these ideas, which is very relevant to organizations generally. I remember in the 80s how everybody felt we should copy Japan. He said, you can't transplant all these ideas because some of them are very specific to a particular culture. He said British soldiers would never be willing to be treated the same way as Prussian soldiers. So this is a man of some real talents. After the war, when he came here to Knowsley, he became an extremely successful playwright, wrote a West End success called The Heiress. I think he was the one responsible for introducing the 12th Earl to his actress wife, Elizabeth Farren, and they were actually starring together in the Knowsley version of that play. Lord George Germain was the Secretary of State for the Colonies, the person who was responsible, the main architect for the war in Britain. He's probably been the person most blamed for the British defeat. I wrote this book because of Lord George Germain and because of one of the members of this audience who, as a student, told me that his ancestor was the man who lost America. And at the time, I had family living and working in America, and I realized how ignorant I was of American history, how little of the Revolution was taught, and I'd never even heard of Germain. It made me really very interested. And indeed, Germain was highly experienced as a military leader. He'd been in the military himself, although this was a problem. He had supposedly disobeyed orders during the 7 Years' War at a major battle of Minden, in which he was commanding the cavalry. And this was on a scale far beyond anything in America. He had 3,000 cavalry. And the accusation was that if he had charged when he received orders, he would have wiped out the French cavalry in what was already a victory of the British and Prussians. It could have been a rout. And he was later, at his own request, court-martialed. And the court-martial went against him, and George II so hated him and these things were highly politicized, that he read the verdict, he had it read out to every regiment of the British Army. But Germain, it seems to me, had what was really the only idea that might have ended in victory. Germain argued that you wanted to have massive force in America. Throughout the 1760s, early 1770s, the British were trying to dictate from a position of weakness. They had virtually no troops in America. He actually sent the commanders more troops than they requested. And his argument was you had to win it very quickly by crushing Washington's army, something that virtually every military historian would have agreed with subsequently. And he always felt that his commanders had let him down by being too timid and too interested in negotiating peace rather than aggressively fighting this war. His argument was this was cruel to extend a war. You don't want a long war for good reasons on both sides. And that you don't negotiate peace until you're in a position of strength. Again, all of which seem very reasonable, but he would be, to some extent, the fall guy. The Howe brothers were removed following Burgoyne's defeat at Saratoga and replaced by this man, Sir Henry Clinton, probably the least known of all the commanders. He was head of the army from 1778. There's only been one biography, but he was easily the most cerebral figure in the British Army in the 18th century. We have all his notes on his reading. That was highly, very considerable military history library that he had, and his reflections on the military as well. And he was the one who really understood this conflict. And he understood two key points. The first was he was the son of an admiral, and he understood that Britain would largely lose at sea, and that the real concern was that the British Navy was outnumbered, and he basically predicted the moment that there's a superior French force off the coast of North America, a smaller British army could be cut off and isolated, which is what basically happened at Yorktown. And the second point he made that anticipated the language of George Bush during Iraq, he said this is a conflict of hearts and minds. It's essentially a political conflict, and that until you really have the support of the Americans, you're not going to win this war. There has to be sort of reaching out to them. Well, Cornwallis, we saw in the clip earlier, as I said, he was very much like a modern military figure, like so many of these admirals and generals. He'd been in the army since his early teens. He was very much the professional army officer. His wife never wanted him to go to America. And curiously, he shared in common with the Howe brothers opposition to the policies that had led to the American Revolution. He was one of only 6 members of the House of Lords who voted against the Stamp Act, which was the first real British tax levied by Parliament in America. And this was someone who all his life sought new commands and new responsibilities. He would go on to put down the Irish Rebellion of 1798, which could have been an equivalent of the American Revolution. And he fought much larger battles in India and played a major role in the acquisition of the southern states of India. Again, an example of someone who was considered a failure during the American Revolution, but who in a different context could be a success. And indeed, he was much commemorated in Britain in his later life, as was Howe, and as was especially this man, Sir George Rodney, who I might even have left out of the book, because Rodney was the only person to emerge not only with his reputation intact, but enhanced by the American Revolution, because during the war, he defeated 3 enemy admirals of 3 different fleets, captured one, Admiral de Grasse of the Saints, and killed another. And the very final part of this book is called Victory, because to a large extent the British lost America, but they retained the rest of their empire. As I say, the men who lost America were the men who won Canada and India, and specifically Rodney won what were known as the Battle of the Saints a few months after Yorktown, one of the most decisive defeats of the French Navy. It would be celebrated up until the time of Trafalgar, the only battle really to have a commemoration, an actual statue and building that was created to celebrate it, that is in Spanish Town, Jamaica. And it reminds us that the British at least retained the rest of their empire. Remember, the Spanish and French had wanted to take Jamaica. They had wanted to revenge the 7 Years' War and really to undermine Britain as an imperial power completely. And finally, there was the Earl of Sandwich, and we're hearing about naval aspects. I don't want to say too much on this later. But along with Lord George Germain, among the politicians, Sandwich was also the scapegoat and person most blamed. This was virtually one of the only wars in which Britain did not have what it called a 2-power navy in the 18th century, a navy large enough to defeat both Spain and France combined, which was always the aim. But this was never Sandwich's fault. Sandwich had warned the cabinet, of which he had been a member longer than anyone else. He'd been a member of the cabinet and running aspects of the Navy before some cabinet members were born. And he'd warned them to mobilize fully at the beginning of this conflict. At the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill, he was saying, arm fully. And Lord North didn't want to do that for 2 reasons. 1, he wanted to save money. And 2, he feared if the British had a huge navy in America, it would frighten the French, who would immediately join on the American side. The idea was to try and keep the French out with a quick victory, a quick military victory in America. Sandwich is an easy object of satire. He was a great libertine, a member of the Hellfire Club, involved in some of the wittiest exchanges with John Wilkes. He met John Wilkes and said, I thought now you'd have either died on the gallows or from the pox, syphilis. And Wilkes replied, well, that would depend, your lordship, on whether I embraced your principles or your mistress. Sandwich can be credited with really building up the British Navy during the American Revolution. Ironically, he fell from power just before the Saints, but to a large extent, he'd helped to lay the foundation of that victory, not least by what was known as copper bottoming the ships, about which we will hear later. So these are the 10 figures. I obviously talk about them at much greater length, and why I think they're people of real substance, that it was a highly experienced war cabinet and experienced British military leaders. The politicians were not the ones responsible for the policies that had led to the revolution, and that should be credited to people like George Grenville and Charles Townshend, who were the first to try to tax America over a decade earlier. So my problem was not trying to rehabilitate all of these people. My concern was that the emphasis on leadership, which happens a lot in military history, not least because when the Army and Navy teach their history, they're very keen to instill in their officers a sense of the importance of leadership, and they're naturally going to focus on that. But it distracts from the real reasons why Britain lost America. And so I'm just going to briefly say why I think the war was lost. One of the reasons is that the British had an army of conquest, but not an army of occupation. Their army was just too small to overcome a population that was 2.5 million in 1776. The British never had more than 40 or 50,000 troops, many of them spread out in America. They were, though, very successful in winning almost every major battle and achieving their objectives. So they took, during the course of this war, every American city. They took Boston, they took New York, they took Philadelphia, the capital, to the point that soon after writing and signing the Declaration of Independence, the members had to scatter as the British Army appeared to invade them under Sir William Howe. And there's no doubt Howe thought once he had Philadelphia, he'd have control of America in the same way as you might control England through London. They took Charleston, the largest city in South Carolina, and yet they still didn't win. And this meant that because they didn't occupy territory and because they didn't regain a significant proportion of the country, they had to feed the army from Britain, which was many tons of food every day. Even candles and coal had to come from Britain. And no country had ever faced a logistical challenge like this in history of bringing so many items out 3,000 miles. When Germain brought the army over, remember, he had a staff of 25 people. I've had a bigger staff than that. And the idea in a world in which everything is handwritten and each order has to go out in personal letters, that he could have commandeered the entire merchant navy of Britain. And the boats were so heavily packed that when one soldier wanted to turn in the night, the entire boat had to turn. I mean, these were, they were sardine tins. They probably didn't look unlike some of the sketches of conditions within ships in the slave trade. And yet they managed to bring off this incredible logistical feat. But they couldn't be good enough to continue the war by these means. It overstretched the administrative system of the time. There were 5 different departments just dealing with the army. Germain actually had no control either over the army or navy. Everything had to be done by request. So logistically, it was too much. The British, of course, never thought they needed to have a big army because they believed that once they appeared in America, enough supporters would appear, people we call loyalists, that the combination of their army and the loyalists would be sufficient to defeat the patriots. The British believed that the patriots were the real tyrants. And they had a lot of evidence. Lord North pointed out in Parliament, if you criticize me, if the press criticizes me, they get away with it. If the press criticizes Congress, they're shut down and put in prison. So he's arguing Britain was a lot freer. The British basically saw this as a power grab by some of the patriot elite in America. And so they always insisted that the real tyranny was on the other side. The most serious error they made was to continue to believe that the majority of Americans supported the British. They never really gave up on this idea, and they kept going to different parts of America in the belief that this magical majority would somehow appear. The problem is, even to this day, it's very difficult to assess exactly who was the proportion of people who were on each side. It's very difficult during wartime, even modern wartime, with all our modern methods of surveys to know what's going on. People change sides even during the war. So even in the middle of this war, Benedict Arnold, one of America's, and arguably at the time, the most successful generals after George Washington, would switch in 1780 to the British side. And so events like that always provided hope. And then the loyalists, many of whom were in London, were telling the British, hang on, the majority of Americans really support you. They're just too frightened to say so. One of the most famous was Joseph Galloway, who'd been a great patriot leader up until about the middle of the war, and then came over to the side of the British when Lord North offered essentially all that the Americans had asked. In the Carlisle Peace Commission, he offered to withdraw all the policies that had led to the American Revolution, really to just retain a token of British power. And Galloway and some people like Benedict Arnold felt that the British had made the key concessions and went over to the British side. But Galloway was saying just a few weeks before Yorktown that 6/9 of the American population support Britain. And we saw the same in the Iraqi war. Chalabi, who was the main source for the CIA and FBI, managed also to persuade the Americans that the majority of people in Iraq were really in favor of the invasion. In other words, these things can still happen. Obviously, credit should also be given to the American military, especially George Washington's leadership. It's remarkable to think what might have happened without Washington. There were 3 other contenders for that position, including 2 British former officers, Charles Lee and Horatio Gates, but both lacked the temperament, especially political temperament, to have been really a success in that position. And of course, the great and famous marksmanship of American hunters and being able to assassinate British officers, essentially. Bunker Hill, to this day, still had some of the highest proportion of British officers killed in any battle. But finally, you could say the British never entirely lost the Revolutionary War, George III was right. They could have continued if they'd wanted. The main army was still in place in New York. They still had an army in Canada. They still held numerous cities from Pensacola, Maine, down to St. Augustine in Florida. They had what was then known as East Florida, what today is largely Florida. What really changed was opinion in Parliament. We can't really call it public opinion because such a small proportion of the population really chose members of Parliament. But even the Army and Navy officers, and the Army and Navy officers were able to sit in Parliament right through into the 20th century, even they were voting against the government, because essentially people felt that they'd been reassured for too long that Americans were on Britain's side, but the evidence at this point seemed to be against it. The war was continuing for too long, and people essentially reevaluate, as they did in Vietnam. The Americans didn't have to get out of Vietnam. They didn't have to get out of Afghanistan. After a while, the political will is lost. People reevaluate the situation. They don't think it's nearly as serious to just accept defeat or to accept the status quo as they did do. And Lord North resigned in March of 1782. His letter of resignation is one of the most remarkable documents of British constitutional history, because George III regarded what he did as a betrayal and made that very clear. And Lord North was someone who was easily bullied by George III, who to a large extent was becoming his own prime minister by his dominance of Lord North. They'd been childhood friends, they were even related. There was a joke at the time that one might be the illegitimate brother of the other, because they had even looked alike as children. But North wrote him and said, there comes, I've stood by you and what you've wanted for so long and tried to obtain success. But there comes a moment when the British Parliament must be the ultimate arbiter, and that you as monarch must accept the decision of Parliament. And I think part of the strength of the letter is that North had not been able to stand up to George III, and yet this is written in such forthright terms and really elucidates a very important concept of the British Constitution, that the monarch, post-1688, the Glorious Revolution, must yield to the views of Parliament. And with that, Lord North resigned. There's a marvellous set of memoirs by Nathaniel Wraxall that describe everything from Germain's dinner party, the night that the British heard about Yorktown, how everybody reacted. And it also describes Lord North hearing about it at number 10 and beating his breast and saying, oh God, it's all over. And how word finally spread. I'm going to end with another little video clip, which I think really marks the end of the Revolutionary War and independence. The irony about celebrating the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence, not only did not many people sign it on the 4th of July, and John Adams, who felt furious that Jefferson had gained such credit, always argued we shouldn't be celebrating 4th of July. It should be the 2nd of July or the date that independence was proposed or much later. Of course, the real moment they were independent was once the peace treaty was signed and the first American ambassador comes to Britain. So this is a scene of John Adams as the first American ambassador. They didn't use the term ambassador at the time. It was minister plenipotentiary, presenting his credentials to George III. And the reason this is effective, and this is good filming, is that every word he speaks is based on the notes that he kept and wrote back to America afterwards. So this is an accurate dialogue. It makes George III slightly younger and thinner than he should be, but I think at the time, ambassadors presented themselves at St. James's Palace. It really successfully creates the ambience. So Jefferson and John Adams had an incredible correspondence in their retirement, basically in the late 70s and 80s. And John Adams wrote to Jefferson and said, "You were wrong to call Jefferson a tyrant. I never thought he was a tyrant and felt you misused the term." It's a tremendous fun correspondence where they even talk about would they like to lead their lives over again, and what age would you go back to if you were to live your life over again. They both agreed they wouldn't want to do their teens again. They'd start in their early 20s. Thank you.